Hi guys, welcome to Joshua's Tech Tips. In this video, we're going to take a look at what is a router. So in our previous video, we learned that switches allow communications to devices on the same network segment. Routers, on the other hand, allow communication between different networks. A typical example of this would be our home network connection to the internet. So routers use something called IP addresses in order to communicate. IP address is basically a unique identifier for your device or your network on the internet. If we refer to this diagram, we'll see that we have an IP address of 181.118.63.152. So this is a unique address for us on the internet. No one else on the internet has this address. So if our device wanted to communicate, so for instance our mobile phone wanted to communicate to facebook.com, what would happen is that we will send the request to our router. Our router would then forward this request to the internet. The internet is made up of thousands of different routers, right? One of the routers would be able to forward this request to Facebook's IP address. In reality, Facebook has dozens of IP addresses. However, for this example, we're just using one. So in this scenario, Facebook's IP address is 69.63.176.13. So that is the address we'll use to communicate with Facebook. Facebook would then use our external IP address to communicate with us as well. So this is how data communication would take place between our IP address as well as Facebook IP address. We could also liken this to the analogy of how a typical post office would work. So if we wanted to send a mail, right, let's say this is our home, we would have a unique mailing address. For instance, and for simplicity's sake, let's use the number 1. Let's say this is our unique mailing address. Let's say we wanted to send information to our best friend and they have a mailing address of 2. So this address is unique to them alone. We would need something, in this scenario, a mailman, someone I should say, to take the mail from our address and deliver it to our friend's address. The mailman would be similar to how the router would work. The router takes information from our local network and sends it to another network, similarly to how a mailman would take information to and from different houses or different addresses. Routers use something called a routing table in order to do this. So in this example, this is just a small home network. So the router has information for just one network. As we can see, the router is just responsible for the 192.168.1.0 IP scheme. And this is a common IP scheme because this is a private IP scheme that a lot of home routers would use. So you may be familiar with this. However, on the internet, we don't use this IP scheme. We use different IP schemes, such as the 181 IP scheme. So what our router knows, it only knows about devices on our local network. So for the internet, the router has something called a default route, and that would be this connection here. So once the router has a request for a device outside of this 192.168 network, it will automatically send the request through its default route out to the internet. And on the internet, there is a lot of different routers and DNS, all these other things that takes place that will be able to send your request to the relevant server and services. Another example of how routers would be used is, say for instance, in an enterprise environment. Let's say you have multiple office locations. Each location has a different network, a different subnet. So in this example, we have 3 different subnets. Site 1 uses 192.168.1.0, Site 2 uses 10.0, and Site 3 uses 20.0. So these networks, although they begin with 192.168, if we look at the third octet, which is .1, .10, .20, they're actually separate networks. So for instance, let's say a device in Site 1 wanted to communicate with a device in Site 3. The request would need to go to the router, right? The router would look at its routing table and you would see that the device for site 3 is out on its Ethernet 3 interface, and it would be able to route the information through that interface and vice versa. So for instance, this scenario is common in multi-location offices. Normally the router would sit at your main office, your head office, and you'd be able to route and send information throughout all the different branch offices using a setup similar to this. And that brings us to the end of this video, guys. Be sure to like and share. Also, if you find value in the content I'm creating, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the notification bell to be notified once a new video is released. Thanks again for viewing. See you soon.